In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a charming young woman, Sylvia Keene, collapses at a lavish supper, poisoned by foxglove hidden in the herb stuffing. As whispers of her scandalous London past swirl, Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster, with a razor-sharp mind, unravels a web of secrets. From a shy cook's niece misled by a vengeful lover to cryptic notes and shadowy strangers, every clue points to a killer hiding in plain sight. Will Marple's quiet wisdom expose the truth before the village's trust is shattered forever? Dive into the herb of death, where love, betrayal, and murder bloom in the heart of England. Chapter 1. A quiet supper. The late summer sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the manicured lawns of Gossington Hall. Roses bloomed in profusion along the gravel path, their scent mingling with the faint tang of wood smoke from a distant bonfire. Inside the hall, Mrs. Amelia Bantry fussed over the dining room, adjusting a vase of dahlias and inspecting the polished silver with a critical eye. Tonight's supper, though modest, was to be a triumph of hospitality, a chance to showcase her new cook's talents, and to introduce a charming young guest to the village. The drawing room, where the party gathered before dinner, hummed with gentle conversation. Colonel Arthur Bantry, ruddy-faced and comfortably ensconced in an armchair, recounted a hunting anecdote to the vicar, Mr. Clement, who nodded politely while stifling a yawn. Griselda, the vicar's young wife, her blonde curls bouncing, chatted animatedly with Sylvia Keene, the evening's novelty. Sylvia, a striking girl of 22 with chestnut hair and lively green eyes, wore a simple muslin dress that belied her city polish. She spoke of her recent travels in Italy, her voice bright, though her glance occasionally darted to the window, as if expecting someone beyond the glass. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, observed the scene with quiet interest. Her faded blue eyes, half hidden behind spectacles, missed nothing: the way Sylvia's fingers twisted her napkin, the faint flush on Griselda's cheeks as she laughed too loudly, the colonel's hearty bluster that masked a certain unease. Miss Marple, with her soft shawl and unassuming air, was often mistaken for a simple spinster, but her mind was a steel trap, cataloguing every gesture, every word. "Dinner is served," announced the butler, and the party moved to the dining room. The table gleamed with candlelight, reflecting off crystal glasses and the heavy silver candelabra. Mrs. Bantry at the head beamed as the first course, a clear consomme, was ladled out. The main course followed, a succulent roast lamb, its crust fragrant with herbs, accompanied by buttered carrots and potatoes au gratin. The herb stuffing, Mrs. Bantry proudly noted, was the work of Mrs. Eccles, their new cook, whose skill had already won village acclaim. Sylvia, seated between Griselda and Mr. Clement, kept the table entertained. "In Florence," she said, her fork poised, "I saw a fresco so vivid it seemed the saints might step off the wall." Her laugh was infectious, but Miss Marple noted a brittleness to it, a hint of strain. The vicar murmured appreciation, while Griselda, ever impulsive, pressed for more details. Colonel Bantry, carving the lamb with gusto, declared Italian art all very well, but nothing beats a good English roast. The meal progressed smoothly, the clink of cutlery and soft chatter filling the room. Mrs. Bantry signaled for the desserter, berry tart with clotted cream, when a sudden change came over Sylvia. Her hand, lifting a coffee cup, trembled violently. The cup clattered to the saucer, spilling dark liquid across the cloth. Her face, moments ago flushed with animation, turned ashen. She clutched her throat, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Miss Keene," Mrs. Bantry cried, rising. Sylvia's eyes widened in panic, then rolled back as she slumped forward, her head striking the table with a dull thud. Griselda screamed, and the colonel, dropping his napkin, barked for the butler to fetch Dr. Haydock. Mr. Clement knelt beside Sylvia, loosening her collar, but her pulse was already faint. her lips tinged blue dot. Miss Marple, her knitting abandoned, moved swiftly to the girl's side. She pressed a gentle hand to Sylvia's wrist, feeling the erratic flutter fade to stillness. The room seemed to hold its breath, the candlelight flickering on faces frozen in shock. Dr. Haydock, arriving within minutes, needed only a moment to confirm the worst. "She's gone," he said gravely, his fingers probing for a pulse that no longer beat. "Poison, I'd wager. Digitalis, perhaps foxglove. I'll need to examine the food." Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair, her hand to her mouth. The colonel muttered about damned bad luck, while Griselda, pale, clung to her husband's arm. Miss Marple, standing quietly, let her gaze sweep the table, the half-eaten plates, the spilled coffee, the herb-flecked remnants of stuffing. Her lips tightened, and her eyes gleamed with a spark that belied her meek exterior. A quiet supper had turned deadly, and Jane Marple knew, with the certainty of long experience, that someone in St. Mary Mead had a secret worth killing for. Chapter 2. The Poisoned Plate. The morning after Sylvia Keene's tragic collapse at Gossington Hall dawned gray and oppressive, as if the skies themselves mourned the loss of the vibrant young woman. A fine mist hung over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a hush broken only by the occasional clop of a milk cart or the distant bark of a dog. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was no less heavy. The dining room, so festive the previous evening, now stood silent, its table stripped of its cloth, the chairs pushed askew. The scent of roses from the garden drifted through an open window, but it could not dispel the chill of death that lingered. Mrs. Amelia Bantry, her usual bustling energy subdued, sat in the morning room, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. Colonel Bantry, pacing before the fireplace, muttered about the infernal nuisance of police inquiries disrupting their routine. Their guests from the fatal supper had departed, but the shadow of the event clung to the household. The arrival of Inspector Welch, the local constable, did little to ease the tension. A tall man with a weathered face and a manner that suggested he preferred facts to pleasantries, Welch carried a notebook already bristling with notes. With him came Dr. Haydock, whose grave expression confirmed the grim findings of his overnight autopsy. "Digitalis," Dr. Haydock announced, addressing the Bantrys and Miss Jane Marple, who had been invited to join the discussion at Mrs. Bantry's insistence. "A toxin derived from foxglove leaves. It was in Miss Keene's system in a lethal dose. Her heart gave out under the strain." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "The herb stuffing from last night's lamb is the likely source. I found traces of digitalis in the remnants we tested." Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "The stuffing, but we all ate it. How could only Sylvia be affected?" Her voice trembled, and the colonel, halting his pacing, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, though his own face was taut with unease. Inspector Welch, flipping open his notebook, fixed his gaze on the doctor. "You're certain of the stuffing, Haydock? No chance it was in her drink or dessert?" His tone was brisk, his pencil poised to record every detail. Haydock shook his head. "The coffee and tart were clean. I tested samples myself. The stuffing, though there was enough digitalis in what remained to suggest deliberate contamination. But here's the puzzle. The other diners show no symptoms. If the poison was in the dish, why did it only kill Miss Keene?" Miss Marple, seated quietly in a high-backed chair, her knitting resting in her lap, tilted her head. Her faded blue eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, flickered with interest. She said nothing, but her fingers twitched, as if itching to unravel the knot of this mystery as easily as she might a tangled skein of wool. She had seen death before, in its many guises, and she knew that poison was a coward's weapon, intimate and calculated. Someone, she felt certain, had meant for Sylvia to die. Welch turned to Mrs. Bantry. "Tell me about the meal, Mrs. Bantry. Who prepared it? Who served it? I'll need every detail, no matter how small." His voice was firm, brooking no evasion. Mrs. Bantry, rallying slightly, straightened in her chair. The meal was prepared by our cook, Mrs. Eccles. She's been with us 3 months and is quite marvelous. The lamb, the stuffing, the vegetables, all her work. The butler, James, and the parlor maid, Rose, served at table. Everything was, as usual, Inspector. I can't imagine how this happened. Mrs. Eccles, Welch repeated, jotting the name. I'll need to speak with her at once. And the herbs and the stuffing, where did they come from? The garden, Mrs. Bantry replied promptly. Mrs. Eccles always uses fresh sage from our herb bed. She's particular about it. Says it's far better than dried. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, but she remained silent, her eyes drifting to the window where the garden lay shrouded in mist. Sage and foxglove, she knew, could be mistaken by an untrained eye, though the error would require either gross ignorance or deliberate intent. She made a mental note to inspect the garden herself. Welch, satisfied for the moment, requested to see the kitchen. The Bantrys led the way, Miss Marple following at a discreet distance, her soft footsteps barely audible on the polished floor. The kitchen was a model of order, its copper pots gleaming, its surfaces scrubbed clean. Mrs. Eccles, a stout woman in her 50s, with a ruddy complexion and a no-nonsense air, stood at the counter, chopping onions with a vigor that suggested she was taking out her frustrations on the hapless vegetables. Her apron was spotless, her hair pinned tightly beneath a cap, but her eyes were red-rimmed, betraying her distress. Mrs. Eccles, Welch began, his tone formal. I understand you prepared the meal last night, including the herb stuffing. Can you confirm the ingredients? Mrs. Eccles set down her knife with a clatter, wiping her hands on her apron. Of course I can, she said, her voice sharp with indignation. Lamb, breadcrumbs, onion, butter, and sage. Fresh sage, picked yesterday morning from the garden. Same as I've always used. I don't hold with poisons, Inspector, and I'll thank you not to suggest I'd be so careless. No one's suggesting anything, Mrs. Eccles, Welch said, though his eyes were keen. But a young woman is dead, and we need to know how. Did anyone else handle the stuffing or the herbs? Mrs. Eccles hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor. My niece, Lily, was here. She's 16, helps out now and then. But she only peeled potatoes and washed dishes. She didn't touch the herbs. I made sure of that. Miss Marple, lingering near the pantry door, noted the slight tremor in Mrs. Eccles' voice. The cook was protective of her niece, perhaps too much so. She stepped forward, her voice gentle but precise. Mrs. Eccles, might I see the sage you used? It would be most helpful. Mrs. Eccles, caught off guard by the soft-spoken spinster, nodded curtly and pointed to a small pile of leaves on the counter. There it is, picked fresh, as I said. Welch examined the leaves, rubbing one between his fingers and sniffing. It smells like sage to me, he muttered, passing it to Haydock, who nodded agreement. But Miss Marple, bending closer, spotted something amiss. Half hidden beneath the cutting board was a single leaf, glossier than the others, its edges smoother, its veins more pronounced. She reached for it, holding it up to the light. And this? She asked, her tone deceptively mild. Mrs. Eccles frowned. That's not mine. Must have got mixed in by mistake. Her voice was defensive, and she snatched the leaf from Miss Marple's hand, tossing it into the bin. Welch's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, making a note in his book. Miss Marple, however, felt a prickle of certainty. The leaf was foxglove. She was sure of it. She had seen its deadly beauty in many a village garden, and she knew its power. But she held her tongue, knowing that to speak now would be to alert the guilty. Instead, she smiled faintly and stepped back, letting Welch continue his questions. The inspector turned his attention to the other staff. James, the butler, a dour man with a face like a mournful bloodhound, confirmed that he and Rose had served the meal without incident. Rose, a nervous girl of 19, nodded agreement, her hands twisting in her apron. Neither had noticed anything unusual, though Rose admitted to being a bit flustered by the number of guests. Welch, unimpressed, dismissed them and returned to Mrs. Eccles. "Was anyone else in the kitchen yesterday?" he asked. "Any visitors, delivery boys, anyone at all?" Mrs. Eccles shook her head. "Just Lily and me, and the usual staff. No one else had any business here." Welch closed his notebook with a snap. "I'll need to speak with this Lily, and I'll want a sample of that sage sent to the lab. If there's foxglove in it, we'll find it." Mrs. Bantry, who had been hovering anxiously, looked stricken. "Inspector, surely you don't think someone poisoned the stuffing on purpose? It must be an accident. Mrs. Eccles has never given us cause to doubt her." "We'll see," Welch said grimly. "But poison doesn't get into a dish by itself, Mrs. Bantry. Someone put it there, and I intend to find out who." As the inspector and Dr. Haydock departed to arrange for the sage to be tested, Miss Marple lingered in the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room. The orderliness of the space was almost oppressive, as if Mrs. Eccles had scrubbed away not just dirt but secrets. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small jar of dried herbs on a shelf, its label faded but legible, sage. She wondered if Mrs. Eccles had used it as a fallback, or if the fresh leaves were indeed the source of the poison. She made a mental note to ask later, when suspicion would not fall so heavily on the cook. Outside, the mist had lifted, revealing the garden in all its late summer glory. Miss Marple, excusing herself from the Bantrys, strolled toward the herb bed, her shawl drawn tightly against the morning chill. The sage grew in neat rows, its silvery leaves unmistakable. But a few yards away, near a low stone wall, stood a cluster of foxglove, their tall spikes heavy with bell-shaped flowers. She bent to examine them, noting their glossy leaves, so similar to sage in texture, yet so deadly in effect. A careless hand, she mused, might pluck the wrong plant, especially in haste or poor light. But Mrs. Eccles was not careless, and Lily, if she had picked the herbs, would have been guided by her aunt's instructions, or someone else's. Miss Marple straightened, her mind racing. The poison had targeted Sylvia, but how? The stuffing was a communal dish, yet only one plate had been fatal. She considered the serving process. James and Rose had passed the dishes, but the portions were not pre-plated. Sylvia could not have been singled out unless the poison was added after the stuffing reached her pleated, difficult feet in a crowded dining room. Or perhaps, she thought, the poison was not in the stuffing itself but in something else, something only Sylvia consumed. But Haydock had ruled out the coffee and tart. The puzzle was maddening, yet Miss Marple felt a thrill of anticipation. The truth, she knew, lay in the details, and she would find it. Returning to the hall, she found Mrs. Bantry in the drawing room, pouring tea with a shaking hand. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice plaintive, "what a dreadful business. Poor Sylvia, so young, so full of life. And now the police, poking about, upsetting everyone. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple accepted a cup, her expression serene. "It is dreadful, Mrs. Bantry. But we must trust Inspector Welch to do his work. And we must think carefully about last night. Did you notice anything unusual about Sylvia? Her manner, her appetite, anything at all?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, stirring her tea absently. She was charming, as always. A bit nervous, perhaps, but she'd only been in the village a fortnight. I thought she was just shy. She ate heartily, I'm sure of it. The lamb, the stuffing, everything, and her coffee. Miss Marple asked, her voice soft. Mrs. Bantry blinked. Her coffee. Oh yes, she drank it. Spilled some too, just before she collapsed. But Dr. Haydock said the coffee was safe. Miss Marple nodded, filing this away. The spilled coffee was a detail worth remembering. She sipped her tea, her mind turning to Sylvia's background. The girl had come to St. Mary Mead to stay with her aunt, Mrs. Pritchard, after some trouble in London. What trouble, Miss Marple wondered, and had it followed her here? As she rose to leave, promising to return later, Miss Marple glanced at the dining room door, now closed. Behind it lay the scene of a crime, and somewhere in that room more, in the kitchen or the garden, lay the clue that would unravel it. She thought of Sylvia's pale face, her trembling hands, and the single foxglove leaf beneath the cutting board. Someone had made a mistake, or someone had been very clever. Either way, Jane Marple intended to find out. Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. The pattern of the crime was taking shape, like the shawl in her hands. Sylvia's death was no accident, of that she was certain. But the motive, greed, jealousy, revenge, remained elusive. She thought of Mrs. Eccles, so quick to defend her niece, of Lily, a girl who might be innocent or complicit, of the guests, each with their own secrets. And she thought of the village itself, with its quiet lanes and hidden currents of malice. St. Mary Mead, she knew, was no stranger to murder, and neither was she. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The poisoned plate was only the beginning, and she would follow its trail to the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Chapter 3. The cook's Nista mist that had cloaked St. Mary Mead the previous day had burned away by noon, leaving the village bathed in a brittle autumnal light. The hedgerows glowed with hawthorn berries, and the air carried the sharp tem of fallen leaves. At Gossington Hall, however, the brightness did little to lift the pall of suspicion that hung over the household. Sylvia Keene's death had sent ripples through the village, and every whispered conversation in the grocer's shop or the Blue Boar encircled back to the poisoned stuffing and the unthinkable question: who had wanted the girl dead? Miss Jane Marple, sitting in her neat cottage parlor with a cup of tea and her knitting, pondered the same question. Her needles clicked in a steady rhythm, but her mind was far from the soft wool in her hands. The foxglove leaf she had spotted in the kitchen, so carelessly or cunningly tucked beneath the cutting board, haunted her thoughts. It was a clue, she was certain, but whether it pointed to accident or design remained unclear. The key, she felt, lay not in the leaf itself, but in the hands that had placed it there. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Bantley, her face flushed with agitation, swept in, her hat slightly askew. "Oh, Miss Marple," she exclaimed, sinking into a chintz-covered chair, "it's too dreadful. Inspector Welch has been at the hall again, asking questions, upsetting everyone. He's convinced the poison was deliberate, and now he's got his eye on poor Mrs. Eccles. And that's not the worst of it. People are talking, saying all sorts of nonsense about Sylvia." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her faded blue eyes keen behind her spectacles. "Gossip is inevitable, Mrs. Bantry," she said gently, "but it often holds a grain of truth. What are they saying about Miss Keene?" Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, lowering her voice as if the walls might overhear. "That she wasn't as innocent as she seemed. The postman's wife claims Sylvia was seen walking alone at night, near the old quarry, and Mrs. Price at the shop says she had a row with someone in London before she came here. Oh, Jane, what if she was mixed up in something awful?" Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "We must be careful not to leap to conclusions," she said, "but these rumors are worth noting. Now, tell me about Inspector Welch. What has he been asking?" Mrs. Bantry sighed, twisting her gloves in her hands. "He wanted to know about the kitchen staff, especially Mrs. Eccles' niece, Lily. He thinks she might have had something to do with the herbs, though Mrs. Eccles swears Lily barely touched anything. He sent the sage to a laboratory in Dannemouth, and he's calling Lily in for questioning this afternoon." Poor child, she's only 16. Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. Lily, she murmured. Yes, I should like to meet her. A young girl, impressionable, perhaps easily led. Tell me, Mrs. Bantry, what sort of girl is she? Mrs. Bantry frowned, considering. Quiet, mousy, always clinging to her aunts. Apron strings. She's no beauty thin, with a pinched face and eyes that never quite meet yours. But she's obedient, or so Mrs. Eccles says. I can't imagine her doing anything so wicked as poisoning someone. People are often more complex than they appear, Miss Marple said softly. I think I shall pay a visit to Gossington Hall this afternoon. It might be useful to speak with Lily myself. Mrs. Bantry brightened. Oh, would you? Arthur says I'm being silly, but I can't help feeling there's more to this than meets the eye. You've such a knack for seeing things, Jane. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already turning to the task ahead. After seeing Mrs. Bantry out, she donned her black felt hat and a sensible coat, picked up her umbrella more for propriety than necessity and set off for the hall. The walk through St. Mary Mead was brisk, the village streets alive with the hum of daily life. Children played in the lane, and the blacksmith's hammer rang out from his forge. Yet beneath the normalcy, Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of unease, as if the village itself were holding its breath. At Gossington Hall, she found Inspector Welch in the morning room, his notebook open and his expression dour. Mrs. Eccles stood before him, her arms crossed, her face a mask of defiance. Lily, the niece, hovered in the doorway, a slight figure in a faded dress, her hands twisting nervously. Her hair, a dull brown, was pulled back tightly, and her eyes darted between her aunt and the inspector like those of a frightened rabbit. Miss Marple, Welch said, nodding curtly. Mrs. Bantry mentioned you might stop by. I'm just finishing. With Mrs. Eccles. His tone suggested he found her presence an inconvenience, but Miss Marple was accustomed to such reactions. She smiled benignly and took a seat, her umbrella resting across her knees. Now, Mrs. Eccles, Welch continued, you're certain no one else was in the kitchen the day of the supper? No tradesmen, no visitors? Mrs. Eccles bristled. I've told you, Inspector, it was just me, Lily, and the usual staff. The butcher's boy came in the morning, but he didn't go near the herbs. I keep a tight ship, and I don't let strangers meddle. Welch turned to Lily, who shrank under his gaze. And you, Miss Lily? Your aunt says you only washed dishes and peeled potatoes. Is that true? Lily nodded, her voice barely audible. Yes, sir. I didn't touch the stuffing. I wouldn't know how. Miss Marple watched the girl closely, noting the tremor in her hands, the way her eyes avoided contact. Fear, she thought, but of what? The inspector's questions, or something deeper. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft and coaxing. Lily, dear, you mustn't be frightened. We only want to understand what happened. Do you ever help your aunt in the garden, picking herbs, perhaps? Lily's cheeks flushed, and she glanced at Mrs. Eccles, who gave a sharp nod. Sometimes, she mumbled, but not that day. Aunt said to leave the sage to her. Mrs. Eccles interjected, her tone fierce. That's right. I picked the sage myself, first thing in the morning. Lily was nowhere near it. You're barking up the wrong tree, Inspector. Welch's eyes narrowed, but he made a note and dismissed them, promising to follow up. As Mrs. Eccles bustled Lily out, Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate. Inspector, she said, might I have a word with Lily alone? I believe a quieter setting might put her at ease. Welch hesitated, then shrugged. If you think it'll help. But don't expect much. She's scared witless, and hasn't said anything useful. Miss Marple found Lily in the scullery, scrubbing a pot with unnecessary vigor. The girl started at her approach, dropping the pot with a clatter. Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you. No need to be alarmed, Miss Marple said, her smile warm. She settled onto a stool, her hands folded in her lap. I only want to chat. You must be dreadfully upset about what happened to Miss Keene. Lily nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. It's awful, ma'am. She was so kind, always smiling. I can't believe she's gone. Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone gentle. You saw her at the supper, didn't you? From the kitchen. Perhaps, or when you helped serve. Lily's hand stilled. I didn't serve, ma'am. I stayed in the kitchen. But I saw her through the hatch, laughing with Mrs. Clement. She looked happy. And the herbs, Miss Marple continued, as if the thought had just occurred to her. Do you know sage when you see it? It's such a lovely plant, but there are others in the garden that look similar, aren't there? Lily's face paled, and she bit her lip. I'm not much for gardening, ma'am. Aunt always tells me what's what. I wouldn't know sage from anything else. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind was racing. Lily's ignorance was plausible, yet the foxglove leaf in the kitchen suggested someone had handled the deadly plant. If not Mrs. Eccles, then who? She patted Lily's hand, her voice soothing. You're a good girl, Lily. But if you remember anything, even something small, you must tell me. It could be important. Lily nodded, her eyes brimming with tears, and Miss Marple left her to her scrubbing. Stepping into the garden, she made her way to the herb bed, where the sage grew in orderly rows, its leaves soft and silvery. Beyond it, the foxglove stood, tall, their purple bells swaying in the breeze. She plucked a sage leaf and a foxglove leaf, holding them side by side. The resemblance was striking. Both were broad, slightly fuzzy, with a similar shape. But the foxglove was glossier, its veins more pronounced. A mistake was possible, she conceded, but only by someone unfamiliar with plants or someone who wanted to make it look like a mistake. She wandered further, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the foxglove patch, she noticed a faint indentation in the soil, as if someone had stood there recently. The earth was soft, and a partial footprint small, like a girl's, caught her attention. She bent to examine it, her heart quickening. Lily, perhaps, or another. She straightened, tucking the leaves into her handbag for later comparison. Back at the hall, she found Mrs. Bantry in the library, sorting through a pile of condolence letters. Any luck with Lily? Mrs. Bantry asked, her voice hopeful. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her umbrella propped beside her. She's frightened, poor child, and not forthcoming. But I believe she knows more than she's saying. Tell me, Mrs. Bantry, does Lily have any friends in the village? A young man, perhaps, or a confidant? Mrs. Bantry frowned, tapping a letter against her palm. I wouldn't know. Mrs. Eccles keeps her close, says she's shy. But now you mention it, I've seen her talking to that Barker boy, Tom, the blacksmith's son. He's a bit of a rogue, always loitering by the mill. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Tom Barker, she murmured. Yes, I shall have to look into him. She rose, her mind already mapping out her next steps. A young man, a shy girl, a deadly herb. The pieces were beginning to fit, though the picture was far from clear. That afternoon, she walked to the village green, where the mill stood, its wheel creaking lazily. The surrounding woods were a known haunt for village youths, and Miss Marple, moving quietly, hoped to catch a glimpse of Tom Barker or Lily. The air was cool, scented with pine and damp earth, and the path was littered with cigarette ends and sweet wrapper, signs of clandestine meetings. Near a gnarled oak, she found a scrap of cloth, blue and frayed, caught on a bramble. It matched the shade of Lily's dress, and Miss Marple tucked it away, her lips tightening. As she turned to leave, she heard a rustle in the undergrowth. A figure darted through the trees, Lily, her face pale, her steps hurried. Miss Marple did not call out, but her heart quickened. The girl was hiding something, and it was more than fear of the inspector. She thought of Sylvia, so vibrant at the supper, and of the poison that had stilled her heart. Someone had used Lily, she suspected, exploiting her innocence to deadly ends. Returning to her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her mind elsewhere. She thought of her niece's children, how easily they could be swayed by a kind word or a promise. Lily was no different, a girl caught in a web she did not understand, but who had spun it. Tom Barker, with his roguish charm. Mrs. Eccles, protecting her niece or her own secrets. Or someone else, lurking in the shadows of St. Mary Mead. She opened her handbag, laying out the sage and foxglove leaves, the scrap of cloth, and her notes. The evidence was meager, but Miss Marple had solved mysteries with less. She thought of the footprint, the cigarette ends, the rumors about Sylvia's nighttime walks. A pattern was emerging, faint but unmistakable, like the first stitches of a complex design. Sylvia's death was no random act, but a calculated one, and the cook's niece was at its heart. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the ordinary details of village life. She would find it, not with bluster or force, but with the quiet persistence of one who understood the human heart and its capacity for darkness. Chapter 4. Sylvia's Secrets. The autumn light in St. Mary Mead had softened by mid-afternoon, casting long shadows across the village's cobbled lanes and thatched cottages. A brisk wind stirred the leaves, sending them skittering along the path to Gossington Hall, where the tragedy of Sylvia Keene's death continued to cast a pall. The village, though outwardly serene, buzzed with undercurrents of speculation. Every glance exchanged at the post office, every hushed word at the church gate, circled back to the poisoned supper and the question that hung unanswered. Why Sylvia? Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage's small parlor, sipped her tea and contemplated the growing tangle of clues. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, the needle silent for once, as her mind wove through the details of the case. The foxglove leaf in the kitchen, Lily's nervous demeanor. The footprint near the garden all pointed to a deliberate act, but the motive remained elusive. Sylvia, so charming and lively at the Bantry's table, had been no random victim, Miss Marple felt certain. The girl's past, hinted at in village whispers, held the key. Her thoughts were interrupted by a visit from Mrs. Pritchard, Sylvia's aunt, who arrived unannounced, her face drawn in her black mourning dress accentuating her pallor. Mrs. Pritchard, a widow of modest means who lived in a tidy cottage near the church, was known for her reserve, but today her composure was fraying. She clutched a laced handkerchief, her eyes red from weeping. "Miss Marple," she began, settling uneasily into a chair, "I heard you've been helping with Sylvia's case. I couldn't stay away. I need to know what happened to my poor girl. She was all I had left." Miss Marple set her teacup down, her expression one of gentle sympathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Pritchard. I'm doing what I can to understand the truth. Perhaps you could help me. Tell me about Sylvia, her life, her reasons for coming to St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Pritchard dabbed her eyes, her voice trembling. "She was such a bright girl, full of dreams. She grew up in London, you know, with my brother and his wife, but they didn't always see eye to eye. Sylvia was headstrong, wanted to make her own way. Last year, she took a position as a governess for a wealthy family, the Harrisons, in Mayfair. It was a good post, but something went wrong. She wouldn't tell me much, only that she'd left under a cloud. 6 weeks ago, she came to me, saying she needed peace. I thought St. Mary Mead would be a fresh start." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her tone remained soft. "Under a cloud, you say? Did she mention any trouble with the Harrisons? A disagreement, perhaps, or an accusation?" Mrs. Pritchard hesitated, twisting her handkerchief. She was vague, but I gathered there was a scandal. Something about missing jewelry. Sylvia swore she was innocent, and I believed her. She was no thief, but the suspicion hurt her deeply. She burned some letters she received here. That upset her. I saw the ashes in the grate, but never read them. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloguing this new information. Burned letters suggested secrets, perhaps threats or demands. Did she ever speak of anyone from her past following her here? A friend, or someone less friendly? Mrs. Pritchard's brow furrowed. She mentioned a man once, a clerk named John Harrow. Said he was trouble, but she wouldn't elaborate. I assumed he was part of the London business. Oh, Miss Marple, do you think someone from her past did this? It's too early to say, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, but every detail helps. Did Sylvia seem frightened in her last days, or secretive? She was restless, Mrs. Pritchard admitted. She'd go for long walks, sometimes at dusk, and come back looking troubled. I thought it was just her spirits, but now, I wonder if she was meeting someone. Miss Marple thanked her, promising to keep her informed, and saw her out. As the door closed, she returned to her chair, her mind racing. Sylvia's London scandal, the burned letters, the mysterious John Harrowall pointed to a life more complicated than the village had guessed. She thought of her own niece, Mabel, who had once been entangled in a youthful indiscretion. Young women, Miss Marple knew, could be drawn into trouble by charm or desperation, and Sylvia's charm had been evident at the supper. Determined to pursue this thread, Miss Marple donned her coat and hat and set out for the vicarage, where Griselda Clement, the vicar's lively young wife, was known to be a font of village gossip. The vicarage, a rambling house with ivy-clad walls, stood at the edge of the village, its garden bright with late asters. Griselda, in a flamboyant green dress, was pruning roses with more enthusiasm than skill when Miss Marple arrived. Miss Marple, Griselda exclaimed, tossing her secateurs aside. What a treat! Come in, have some tea. I suppose you're here about poor Sylvia. Isn't it ghastly? Leonard's been praying for her soul, but I can't stop thinking about that. Supper. Miss Marple smiled, accepting a seat in the cluttered drawing room. It is a terrible affair, Griselda. I wondered if you might have heard anything about Sylvia, her habits, her friends. You have such a knack for noticing things. Griselda's eyes sparkled with mischief. Well, I shouldn't gossip, but since it's you, Sylvia was a bit of a mystery. She was all charm at the Bantries, but I saw her once by the old mill, late in the evening. She was alone, or so I thought, but there was a shadow moving in the trees. Could have been someone watching her. And Mrs. Price at the shop said Sylvia bought notepaper and burned through it awfully fast, like she was writing letters she didn't want anyone to see. Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her bag, began to click softly. The mill, you say? That's interesting. Did you recognize the shadow? Griselda shook her head. Too dark, and I wasn't close, but it gave me the creeps. Oh, and there's talk she had a sweetheart in London who broke her heart. Pure speculation, mind you, but you know how the village loves a romance. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the mill, a place she had already marked as significant. Griselda's tale of a shadow was vague but suggestive, and the burned notepaper corroborated Mrs. Pritchard's account. Sylvia had been hiding something or someone. Thanking Griselda, Miss Marple made her way to the mill, her umbrella tapping the ground with each step. The mill, its wheels stilled by disuse, stood in a clearing fringed by willows. The surrounding woods were dense, their paths worn by generations of trysting couples and mischievous boys. Miss Marple moved carefully, her eyes scanning the ground. Near a moss-covered stone, she found a cigarette butt, its tip stained with lipstick, a shade she recalled Sylvia wearing at the supper. Nearby, half buried in leaves, was a scrap of paper, torn and smudged but bearing the initials JH in a looping hand. She tucked it into her handbag, her heart quickening. John Harrow, perhaps, or a red herring planted to mislead. As she straightened, a rustle in the bushes made her pause. A squirrel darted out, and she smiled at her own jumpiness. But the mill, she sensed, held secrets. Sylvia's walks here, her burned letters. The shadow Griselda had seen all suggested a clandestine connection, one that had ended in poison. Miss Marple made a mental note to ask Inspector Welch about John Harrow, though she suspected the answer lay closer to home. Returning to the village, she stopped at the post office, where Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was sorting letters with her usual air of knowing everyone's business. Miss Marple, with her knack for disarming even the most guarded, inquired casually about Sylvia's mail. "Oh, she got letters. All right," Miss Weatherby said, her eyes gleaming. "2 or 3, from London, I'd say, judging by the postmarks. She'd collect them herself. Never let Mrs. Pritchard near them. Burned them. Most likely Mrs. Pritchard complained about the ashes." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind fitting this into the puzzle. Sylvia's secrecy was no mere quirk, it was a shield. But against whom? She thought of Lily, the cook's niece, whose nervousness suggested more than simple fear. Had Sylvia confided in her, or had Lily stumbled across something she shouldn't have? That evening, Miss Marple called on Inspector Welch at the police station, a small building smelling of ink and damp wood. Welch, poring over a report, looked up with a mix of irritation and curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you've got another theory." "I'm up to my ears in lab results and witness statements. I shan't take much of your time," she said, settling into a chair. "Have you heard of a John Harrow, a clerk from London?" Sylvia mentioned him to her aunt, said he was trouble. Welch's eyebrows rose. "Harrow, first I've heard of him. I'll wire Scotland Yard, see if he's known. But I'm more interested in that sage. The lab found no foxglove in the samples we sent, which means the poison was added to the stuffing after it was prepared. Someone in that kitchen had a hand in it." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "A troubling thought, Inspector. But I wonder if you might look into Sylvia's time in London. There was a scandal, something about missing jewelry. It may have followed her here." Welch made a note, his skepticism evident. "I'll look into it, but I'm not chasing shadows. The answer's here, in St. Mary Mead. That Lily girl's hiding something. I'd bet my badge on it." Miss Marple rose, her umbrella in hand. "You may be right, Inspector. But sometimes the shadows are worth chasing." She left him to his reports, her mind already planning her next move. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts far afield. She spread out her clues: the foxglove leaf, the scrap of paper with JH, the cigarette butt, the footprint. She thought of Sylvia, a girl with secrets, and of Lily, a pawn in a game she didn't understand. The mill, the letters, the London scandal all were threads in a web, and at its center was a killer. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. She thought of her old friend, Miss Hartnell, who had once been duped by a charming rogue. Sylvia, she suspected, had met someone similar, a man who used her trust to his own ends. John Harrow might be that man, or he might be a distraction. Either way, Miss Marple knew the truth lay in Sylvia's secrets, and she would uncover them, one quiet step at a time. As the clock struck 9, she set her knitting aside and made a list: motive, opportunity, knowledge. Someone had known Foxglove's power, had access to the kitchen, and had a reason to silence Sylvia. The list was short, but it was a start. St. Mary Mead, with its tidy gardens and hidden passions, was a stage for murder, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was its keenest observer. Chapter 5. The village whisper. The autumn days in St. Mary Mead grew shorter, the sunlight slanting through the elms with a melancholy glow that mirrored the village's mood. Sylvia Keene's death had unsettled the quiet community, and the once chatter of neighbors now carried a sharp edge of suspicion. At the grocer's, the baker's, the church porch, every conversation turned to the poisoned supper at Gossington Hall, each speaker embellishing the tale with their own flourish of dread or conjecture. Yet beneath the gossip, a thread of truth waited to be plucked, and Miss Jane Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, was determined to find it. In her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting a soft rhythm against the silence. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the fragments of the case. The foxglove leaf, Lily's evasions, Sylvia's burned letters, the initials J.H. Each was a piece of a puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. The village whispers, she knew, could be as revealing as they were misleading, and today she meant to listen closely. Her morning began with a visit to the Blue Boar in a modest establishment where the village's less pious gathered to exchange news over pints of ale. Miss Marple, with her black hat and sensible coat, drew curious glances as she entered, but her air of quiet respectability disarmed the room. She ordered a glass of ginger beer and settled at a corner table, her ears attuned to the hum of conversation. Mrs. Coppins, the grocer's wife, held court near the bar, her voice carrying over the clink of glasses. "I'm telling you, that Sylvia Keene wasn't all she seemed," she declared, her chins wobbling with conviction. "Came from London, didn't she? My cousin's friend in Chelsea says she was mixed up with a bad lot thieves maybe, or worse. No wonder someone wanted her out of the way." Her companion, a ruddy-faced farmer named Giles, snorted. "Thieves. You've been reading too many penny dreadfuls, Martha. She was a slip of a girl, too pretty for her own good. Bet it was a jealous lover, some city chap who followed her here." Miss Marple sipped her ginger beer, her expression serene but her mind alert. The London connection echoed Mrs. Pritchard's account of Sylvia's scandal, and while Mrs. Coppin's tale was likely exaggerated, it suggested Sylvia's past was no secret, even beyond St. Mary Mead. She made a mental note to press Inspector Welch for any news from Scotland Yard as she listened. The postman, Mr. Dobbs, joined the group, wiping foam from his mustache. "I saw something odd, mind you," he said, lowering his voice. "Night before the supper, there was a stranger near Gossington Hall. Tall fellow, dark coat, skulking by the gate. Didn't look local. I told the inspector, but he didn't seem fussed. Mrs. Coppins pounced. A stranger there, you see. I bet he slipped into the kitchen and tampered with that stuffing. They say poison's a city trick." Miss Needles, tucked in her bag, seemed to itch for action. A stranger was a convenient scapegoat, but Mr. Dobbs' sighting warranted investigation. She finished her drink and slipped out, her umbrella tapping the cobbles as she headed for the post office. Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, was a fount of information, her sharp eyes missing little that passed through her hands. "Good morning, Miss Weatherby," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I wonder if you've had any unusual mail lately, perhaps for Miss Keene, or even an unfamiliar name." Miss Weatherby, sorting parcels with practiced efficiency, pursed her lips. "You're on about that poor girl's death, aren't you? Well, I'll tell you what I told the inspector. Sylvia got a few letters, all from London, but nothing out of the ordinary. Burned them, she did, or so her aunt says. But there was one thing last week. A letter came for a Mr. J. Harris, care of the Blue Boar. No one claimed it, and it's still here. London postmark, same as Sylvia's." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "J. Harris," she murmured. "Might I see the envelope, if it's not too much trouble?" Miss Weatherby, flattered by the attention, retrieved the letter from a locked drawer. The envelope was plain, the handwriting bold but unremarkable. Miss Marple noted the postmark dated 10 days ago and the faint smudge of ink on the flap. "Most curious," she said. "May I suggest you hold on to it for Inspector Welch? It could be important." Leaving the post office, Miss Marple turned toward Gossington Hall, her mind buzzing. J. Harris was close enough to J.H. to be significant, and the timing of the letter suggested a connection to Sylvia's final days. Was it John Harrow, the clerk Mrs. Pritchard had mentioned, or another figure from Sylvia's past? She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Bantry, who had once received a mysterious letter that turned out to be a prank. This, she sensed, was no prank. At the hall, Mrs. Bantry greeted her with a mix of relief and agitation. "Jane, thank goodness. The inspector's been here again, poking about the kitchen, and Mrs. Eccles is in a state. He's convinced the poison was added in the house, but I can't believe anyone here would do such a thing." Miss Marple settled into the morning room, accepting a cup of tea. "It is distressing, Mrs. Bantry, but we must face facts. Someone had access to Foxglove and a reason to harm Sylvia. I've been thinking about Lily, Mrs. Eccles' niece. You mentioned she's close to her aunt, but does she have any other attachments in the village?" Mrs. Bantry frowned, stirring her tea. "Lily's a quiet thing, always underfoot in the kitchen. Mrs. Eccles says she's dreamy, forever reading those silly romance novels. I've seen her scurrying about, but I don't know her friends. There's that Barker boy, Tom, who loiters by the mill. I've caught her glancing at him when she thinks no one's looking." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Tom Barker, yes, I've heard his name. A young man with charm, I gather. Such boys can be persuasive, especially to a girl like Lily." She paused, her voice gentle. "Might I speak with Mrs. Eccles again? I'd like to see Lily's room, if it's not too much trouble." Mrs. Bantry, eager to help, led her to the kitchen, where Mrs. Eccles was kneading dough with a vigor that suggested she was venting her frustrations. Her face, flushed from the heat of the oven, hardened at the sight of Miss Marple. "Not you, too," she said, wiping her hands. "I've had enough of the inspector's questions. I didn't poison anyone, and neither did Lily." "I'm sure you didn't, Mrs. Eccles," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But I'd like to understand Lily better. Might I see where she stays? It could help clear her name." Mrs. Eccles hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Upstairs, second door on the left. She's out fetching eggs, but don't go rummaging through her things." Miss Marple climbed the narrow servants' stairs, her steps light but purposeful. Lily's room was small, its walls bare save for a faded print of a shepherdess. A narrow bed, a rickety chair, and a small table comprised the furniture, with a pile of tattered novels stacked in a corner. Miss Marple, careful not to disturb, examined the room with a keen eye. Under the pillow, she found a pressed flower, its purple petals unmistakable. Foxglove. Her lips tightened. A keepsake, perhaps, or a clue to Lily's involvement. She opened one of the novels, a cheap romance with a lurid cover, and a slip of paper fell out. It bore a single word, "Mill," in a childish scrawl. Miss Marple tucked it into her handbag, her mind racing. The mill, where Sylvia had walked, and Griselda had seen a shadow, was emerging as a nexus of secrets. She thought of her own youth, when a pressed flower had meant a sweetheart's promise. For Lily, it might mean something far darker. Downstairs, she thanked Mrs. Eccles, who grunted in response, and rejoined Mrs. Bantry. "Lily is a puzzle," she said. "She may be innocent, but she's caught up in something. I must visit the mill again, and I'd like to speak with Tom Barker." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "You think that boy's involved? He's a scamp, but murder people surprise us, Mrs. Bantry," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "And young men can be reckless when their hearts are engaged." That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the mill, the wind tugging at her shawl. The clearing was quiet, the wheel creaking faintly in the breeze. She moved to the spot where she had found the cigarette butt and the JH scrap, her eyes scanning for new signs. Near a clump of nettles, she spotted a glint of metal, a cheap locket, its clasp broken. Inside was a tiny photograph of a young woman, not Sylvia, but someone with a passing resemblance. She pocketed it, her heart quickening. A memento, perhaps, or a deliberate plant. As she turned to leave, she heard footsteps on the path. Tom Barker, a lanky youth, with tousled hair and a cocky grin, sauntered into view, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He stopped short at the sight of her, his grin fading. "Miss Marple, what are you doing here?" "Just enjoying a walk." "Mr. Barker," she said, her smile disarming. "This is a lovely spot, though I hear it's popular with young people. Did you ever see Miss Keene here?" Tom's eyes narrowed, but he shrugged. "Might have. She walked around a lot." "Didn't. She never spoke to her, though." His tone was casual, but his fingers twitched, betraying unease. "And Lily?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice gentle. "I hear you're friends. She's such a shy girl, but I imagine she trusts you." Tom's face reddened. "Lily's all right. Helps her aunt. Doesn't bother me. Don't go making trouble for her, miss." He flicked his cigarette away and strode off, leaving Miss Marple to ponder his defensiveness. Back at her cottage, she laid out her finds. The pressed foxglove, the mill note, the locket, the JH scrap. She thought of the village. Whispers Sylvia's London enemies, the stranger by the gate, the unclaimed letter to J. Harris. Each was a thread, but the pattern was elusive. She recalled a case in her youth, when a village lad had hidden a theft behind a mask of charm. Tom Barker, she suspected, was hiding something, and Lily was his unwitting accomplice. She visited Inspector Welch that evening, finding him at the station, his desk littered with reports. "Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his eyes, "you're tireless. What now?" "I've found a few things," she said, producing the locket and the mill note. "And there's a letter at the post office for A.J. Harris. It may be nothing, but I thought you should know. Have you heard from Scotland Yard about John Harrow?" Welch nodded. "They're looking into him. And that jewelry scandal you mentioned, turns out Sylvia was suspected of stealing a sapphire brooch from the Harrisons. No proof, but the family let her go. If someone held a grudge, it's a motive." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Indeed. But I wonder if the motive is closer to home. Tom Barker, for instance. He's evasive, and he knows Lily. A young man's jealousy can be a powerful thing." Welch snorted. "Barker's a layabout, but poison, that's a stretch. Still, I'll have a word with him." He took the locket and note, promising to follow up, as Miss Marple walked home. The village was settling into dusk, the lights in the cottages warm against the gathering dark. She thought of Sylvia, her secrets burned to ashes, and of Lily, caught in a web she didn't understand. The village whisper was growing louder, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was closing in on its source. Her needles resumed their rhythm by the fire, each stitch a step toward the truth. She thought of the mill, the locket, the stranger. Someone had woven a deadly trap, and Sylvia had been its prey. But Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was no stranger to traps. She would unravel this one, thread by thread, until the killer stood revealed in the light of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 6. A shadow from London. The autumn chill had settled over St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a crisp embrace that sharpened the senses. The leaves, once vibrant, now carpeted the lanes in shades of amber and crimson, crunching underfoot. As Miss Jane Marple made her way through the village, the air carried the faint smoke of bonfires, and the church bells tolled softly, a reminder of the passing days since Sylvia Keene's death. The village, though outwardly calm, simmered with unease. its residents casting sidelong glances at one another, wondering who among them had poisoned a young woman's plate. Miss Marple, her black hat firmly pinned and her shawl drawn against the breeze, walked with purpose toward the police station. Her mind was a whirl of details: the foxglove leaf, Lily's pressed flower, the J.H. scrap, the locket, and the whispers of Sylvia's troubled past. Each clue was a thread, a tapestry of deceit, but the pattern remained maddeningly incomplete. The village gossip, while colorful, had yielded little beyond speculation. And Miss Marple knew that the truth lay not in rumors, but in the quiet corners where secrets hid. At the station, Inspector Welch sat behind his desk, his face etched with the weariness of a man grappling with too many questions and too few answers. A telegram from Scotland Yard lay open before him, its contents clearly the source of his furrowed brow. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, his expression a mix of resignation and curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, pushing the telegram aside, "you're as persistent as a terrier. I suppose you've got another bit of village tittle-tattle to share." Miss Marple smiled faintly, settling into a chair with her umbrella across her knees. "Not tittle-tattle, Inspector, but a question. Have you had word from London about John Harrow or Sylvia's scandal? I believe her past may hold the key to her death." Welch leaned back, tapping the telegram. "As it happens, you're right on time. Scotland Yard's come through. Sylvia Keene was indeed caught up in a nasty business with the Harrison family in Mayfair. A sapphire brooch went missing, valued at a pretty penny. Sylvia, their governess, was the prime suspect, though no charges were filed. Lack of evidence, they say. The Harrisons sacked her, and she left London under a cloud. But here's the interesting bit. John Harrow, a clerk in the solicitor's office handling the Harrison estate, was questioned too. Seems he had a soft spot for Sylvia, maybe more. He's got no record, but Yard says he's slippery, known for bending rules." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "John Harrow," she murmured. "The J.H. on the scrap I found, perhaps. Did Scotland Yard say if he's been seen recently?" Welch nodded. "That's the other thing. A constable in Dannemouth spotted a man matching Harrow's description 2 days before the supper. Tall, dark coat, city type, could be our stranger by the gate, the one Dobbs saw. I've asked Yard to track him down, but he's not an easy man to pin." Miss Marple's needles, though absent, seemed to click in her mind. A shadow from London, trailing Sylvia to St. Mary Mead, fitted the puzzle, but it was too neat, too convenient. She thought of her old friend, Miss Hartnell, who had once been misled by a charming outsider. Harrow might be the culprit, or he might be a distraction, obscuring a more local hand. "A solicitor's clerk," she said softly, "would know the value of discretion, perhaps the properties of plants, if he were clever." Welch raised an eyebrow. "You think Harrow poisoned her? Slipping foxglove into a kitchen in a strange house isn't easy, Miss Marple." "It points to someone closer, Lily. Maybe, or that Barker lad you mentioned." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone non-committal. "But I'd like to know more about Sylvia's time in London. Did she have enemies among the Harrisons, or was Harrow her only trouble?" Welch shrugged. "Yard's digging, but it'll take time. For now, I'm focused on the kitchen. The lab confirmed no foxglove in the sage stock, so the poison was added during preparation or serving. That narrows it to Mrs. Eccles, Lily, or the serving staff. I'm leaning toward Lily. She's jumpy, and her story's got holes." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning to Lily. The girl's pressed foxglove, her nervous glances, her connection to Tom Barker all suggested she was entangled, willingly or not. But a girl of 16, Miss Marple thought, was more likely a pawn than a mastermind. She thanked Welch and left, her umbrella tapping the path as she headed for Gossington Hall. The hall, its windows gleaming in the afternoon light, seemed to wear its tragedy lightly, but the atmosphere inside was tense. Mrs. Bantry, sorting linens in the drawing room, greeted Miss Marple with a weary smile. "Jane, you're a godsend. The house feels like a morgue, and Arthur's taken to hiding in his study. Have you heard about this London business?" The inspector was here, muttering about jewelry and clerks. Miss Marple settled into a chintz armchair, her handbag at her side. "Yes, I've spoken to Inspector Welch. Sylvia's past is proving more complex than we thought. Tell me, Mrs. Bantry, did Sylvia ever mention the Harrisons or a man named John Harrow? Even a passing remark could be significant." Mrs. Bantry frowned, folding a napkin with unnecessary care. "Not that I recall. She was charming but guarded, always steering the conversation away from herself. I do remember her looking anxious once, when a letter arrived. She tucked it away quickly, said it was nothing, but her hands were shaking." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "Another letter." Mrs. Pritchard mentioned burned ones, and Miss Weatherby spoke of London postmarks. "Sylvia was hiding something, Mrs. Bantry. I wonder if she confided in anyone here, Lily, perhaps, or even Tom Barker." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Lily, she's too timid to be a confidant. But Tom now, he's another matter. I've seen him lounging about, eyeing the maids. If Sylvia was meeting someone at the mill, he'd know. He's got that sly look, like a fox in a henhouse." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "A fox indeed. I think I shall have another word with Mrs. Eccles. Lily's room yielded a clue or two, and I'd like to understand her better." Mrs. Bantry led her to the kitchen, where Mrs. Eccles was rolling pastry, her face set in a scowl. The air smelled of flour and simmering stock, but the cook's mood was anything but warm. "Miss Marple," she said, barely glancing up, "if you're here to pester me about Lily again, I've nothing new to say. She's a good girl, and she didn't touch those herbs." "I'm sure she's a dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing, "but I'd like to ask about her habits. Does she spend much time with Tom Barker? Young girls can be swayed by a charming boy, you know." Mrs. Eccles' hand stilled, her knuckles whitening on the rolling pin. "Tom Barker's a no-good idler, always hanging about the village. Lily's got better sense than to run with him. She's in the kitchen, or her room, reading her books. That's all." Miss Marple nodded, noting the defensive edge in the cook's voice. "Of course. But young people are curious. Has Lily ever mentioned Sylvia, perhaps admiring her or noticing her habits?" Mrs. Eccles snorted. "Lily admired Miss Keene, who wouldn't? She was pretty, lively, everything Lily's not. But they never spoke, far as I know. Lily keeps to herself." Thanking her, Miss Marple left the kitchen, her mind turning to the mill. Mrs. Eccles' protectiveness was natural, but it bordered on obstruction. Lily, she suspected, knew more than her aunt admitted, and Tom Barker was the link. She decided to visit the mill again, hoping to catch a glimpse of the youth, or uncover another clue. The mill stood in its quiet clearing, the willows whispering in the wind. The path was damp from recent rain, and Miss Marple moved carefully, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the spot where she had found the locket, she noticed a fresh cigarette butt, its tip unmarred by lipstick. She bent to pick it up, her fingers brushing a small object half buried in the mud, a button, brass, with a faint engraving of an anchor. It was not Sylvia's, nor Lily's, but it suggested a man's present stone, perhaps, or the elusive stranger. As she straightened, a figure emerged from the tree's lily, her face pale, her hands clutching a basket of apples. She froze at the sight of Miss Marple, her eyes wide. "Oh, I was just walking," she stammered, her voice high. "No need to be alarmed." "Dear," Miss Marple said, her smile gentle. "This is a lovely spot, though it's seen its share of secrets, hasn't it? Did you ever see Miss Keene here, Lily?" Lily's cheeks flushed, and she shook her head vigorously. "No, ma'am. I don't come here much. I was just getting some air." Miss Marple tilted her head, her tone coaxing. "You're a good girl, Lily, but you're troubled. If you know something about Sylvia, you must tell me. It could save someone else from harm." Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she clutched the basket tighter. "I don't know anything, honest. I didn't do anything." She turned and fled, her footsteps fading into the woods. Miss Marple watched her go, her lips tightening. Lily's panic was telling, but it was not guilt. She thought, fear, perhaps of someone or something. She tucked the button and cigarette butt into her handbag, alongside the locket, the mill note, and the J.H. scrap. The mill was a magnet for secrets, and she would return, but for now, she needed to pursue the London angle. Back in the village, she stopped at the Blue Boar, where the afternoon crowd was thinner, but no less talkative. Mrs. Coppins, the grocer's wife, was regaling a group with her latest theory. "Mark my words," she said, "that Sylvia brought trouble with her. My sister's friend in London says she was seen with a shady type, a clerk or some such, before she left. Bet he's the one who did her in." Miss Marple, sipping another ginger beer, listened without comment. The clerk could be John Harrow, but Mrs. Coppin's tale was third-hand at best. Still, it reinforced the idea that Sylvia's London life had cast a long shadow. She thought of her own cousin Edith, who had once fled a scandal only to find it followed her. Sylvia, she suspected, had faced a similar fate. Leaving the inn, Miss Marple called on Mrs. Pritchard, hoping to glean more about Sylvia's final days. The widow, still in mourning black, welcomed her with a weary nod. "I've been thinking, Miss Marple," she said, offering tea, "about what you asked. Sylvia was so careful, always locking her room, checking the post herself. But once I heard her crying, late at night. She said it was nothing, but I found a torn photograph in her wastebasket, her with a man, both smiling. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he had dark hair, like that clerk she mentioned." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A photograph? Did you keep it, Mrs. Pritchard?" The widow shook her head. "I threw it out, thinking it private." "Oh, I wish I'd kept it now." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You couldn't have known. But this is helpful. Did Sylvia ever mention meeting anyone at the mill, or receiving threats?" Mrs. Pritchard's eyes widened. "The mill? No, but she'd come back from her walks looking shaken, like she'd seen a ghost. I thought it was her nerves, but now, thanking her, Miss Marple left, her mind buzzing. The photograph, the mill, John Harrow, the stranger, all pointed to a connection between Sylvia's past and her present. She thought of Tom Barker, his evasiveness, and Lily's fear. The village was a stage, and the players were moving, but the director of this tragedy remained hidden. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts far afield. She spread out her clues: the locket, the button, the cigarette butts, the mill note, the J.H. scrap. She added a new entry to her mental list: the torn photograph, the unclaimed letter to J. Harris. She thought of the stranger by the gate, the shadow Griselda had seen. Was John Harrow the killer, driven by love or revenge? Or was he a scapegoat, diverting attention from a local hand? She recalled a case from her youth, when a village girl had been manipulated by a city suitor. Lily, she suspected, was being used in a similar way, her innocence a tool for someone's malice. Tom Barker, with his sly charm, was a likely candidate, but the London shadow loomed large. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, each stitch a step toward clarity. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the interplay of village and city, innocence and guile. As the clock struck 10, she set her knitting aside and made a plan. Tomorrow, she would revisit the mill, confront Tom Barker, and press Lily once more. The shadow from London was real, but its source was in St. Mary Mead. And Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence and unerring eye, would bring it into the light. Chapter 7. The garden clutha morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a tentative warmth that did little to dispel the chill of suspicion lingering in its lanes. The hedgerows sparkled with dew, and the scent of damp earth mingled with the faint sweetness of late-blooming honeysuckle. Yet the beauty of the season was lost on the residents, whose whispers now carried a sharper edge, each neighbor eyeing the other with a mix of curiosity and distrust. Sylvia Keene's death had cracked the village's placid surface, revealing currents of secrets that Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet tenacity, was determined to navigate. In her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched as she reviewed the clues that had accumulated like leaves in an autumn drift. The foxglove leaf from the kitchen, Lily's pressed flower, the J.H. scrap, the locket, the brass button, the unclaimed letter to J. Harris, each was a fragment of a larger truth, but the motive for Sylvia's murder remained elusive. The London scandal, John Harrow's shadow, and Tom Barker's evasiveness pointed to a web of connections, yet the heart of the crime, Miss Marple felt, lay in the ordinary rhythms of St. Mary Mead. Today, she resolved to return to Gossington Hall, where the garden might yield answers the kitchen had not. She donned her coat and hat, her umbrella, a familiar companion, and set out for the hall. The village was stirring, with children scampering to school and the milkman's cart rattling along the cobbles. Miss Marple nodded to passers-by, her smile disarming, but her eyes missed nothing. The furtive glance of Mrs. Price at the shop, the hushed conversation between two maids at the vicarage gate. The village was a stage, and every player had a role. However small, at Gossington Hall, the gardens were a study in order, their beds meticulously tended despite the season's decline. Mrs. Bantry found pruning roses with a distracted air, greeted Miss Marple with a sigh of relief. "Jane, you're a sight for sore eyes. This business has me at my wit's end. The inspector's been back, asking about Lily again, and Mrs. Eccles is threatening to quit. Have you found anything new?" Miss Marple settled onto a garden bench, her handbag at her side. "A few threads, Mrs. Bantry, but the pattern is still forming. I'd like to examine the herb bed again. The foxglove leaf in the kitchen suggests a mistake or a deliberate act. Might I have a look?" Mrs. Bantry nodded, leading her to the herb garden, where sage grew in neat rows, its silvery leaves catching the light. Beyond it, the foxgloves stood tall, their purple bells faded but still striking. Miss Marple bent to inspect the sage, her fingers brushing the soft leaves. The plants were healthy, undisturbed, but her gaze was drawn to the foxglove patch, where the soil was softer, as if recently trodden. She noticed a faint trail of footprints, small, delicate, like those of a young girl leading from the foxglove to the sage bed. Her heart quickened, but she said nothing, merely noting the direction of the prints. Following the trail, she found it led to a small tool shed at the garden's edge, its door ajar. Inside, the air was musty, smelling of earth and oil. A pair of gardening gloves lay on a workbench, their cuffs stained with green. Miss Marple picked one up, turning it over. Tucked inside was a crumpled note, its edges frayed. She smoothed it out, her eyes narrowing at the scrawled words. "Meet me at the mill, J." The handwriting was not the same as the J.H. scrap, but the initial was telling. She slipped the note into her handbag, alongside her growing collection of clues. Mrs. Bantry, hovering nearby, peered into the shed. "Good heavens, Jane, what's that?" "A note. Do you think it's connected?" "It may be," Miss Marple said, her tone measured. "The garden is full of secrets, Mrs. Bantry. These footprints, these gloves, they suggest someone was here, perhaps in haste. I must speak with Lily again. She's at the heart of this, I'm sure." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Lily, you don't think she—" "Oh, Jane, she's just a child. Children can be led astray," Miss Marple said gently, "and someone, I fear, has led her. She thanked Mrs. Bantry and made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Eccles was scrubbing pots with a ferocity that suggested she was battling her own demons. Mrs. Eccles, Miss Marple began, her voice soft. I've been in the garden, and I found something curious, a pair of gloves, stained green, and a note. I wonder if Lily has been helping with the herbs more than you've said. Mrs. Eccles' hands stilled, her face reddening. Lily's no gardener, Miss Marple. She's clumsy with plants, always has been. If there's gloves, they're mine. And notes. She's no call to be writing notes. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. Yet I found footprints, small ones, near the foxglove. And Lily has been to the mill, hasn't she? With Tom Barker, perhaps. Mrs. Eccles slammed a pot onto the counter, her voice sharp. You leave Tom Barker out of this. He's a scamp, but he's no killer. And Lily's done nothing wrong. You and that inspector, poking about, upsetting her. She's half sick with worry. Miss Marple remained unruffled, her smile sympathetic. I'm only trying to help, Mrs. Eccles. If Lily is innocent, the truth will protect her. Might I speak with her? She may know something she's afraid to share. Mrs. Eccles hesitated, then called for Lily, who appeared from the scullery, her apron damp and her eyes downcast. The girl was thinner than Miss Marple remembered, her face pale, her hands twisting nervously. Lily, Miss Marple said, her tone coaxing, I found a note in the tool shed, and footprints in the garden. Did you pick herbs for the supper? Dear, it's all right to tell me. Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. I didn't, ma'am, I swear. Aunt told me to leave the sage alone. I only went to the garden once, to fetch a trowel. I didn't pick anything. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her voice was firm. And the note, Lily? The one about the mill, signed J. Do you know who wrote it? Lily's face crumpled, and she burst into sobs. I don't know. I found it in the shed, but I didn't write it. Someone told me. Someone said the herbs were safe, but I didn't mean to hurt anyone. Who, Lily? Miss Marple pressed, her voice steady. Who told you about the herbs? Lily's sobs grew louder, and she shook her head, her words incoherent. Mrs. Eccles stepped forward, her arm around the girl. That's enough, Miss Marple. She's told you all she knows. Leave her be. Miss Marple nodded, stepping back, but her mind was racing. Lily's outburst confirmed her suspicions. The girl had handled the foxglove, however unwittingly, and someone had guided her hand. The notes, J, could be John Harrow, Tom Barker, under an alias, or a third party entirely, she thought. Of her own niece, Joan, who had once been swayed by a manipulative friend. Lily, she felt, was a pawn in a larger game, and the player was close. Leaving the kitchen, Miss Marple returned to the garden, her eyes scanning the foxglove patch. The footprints were clearer in the daylight, leading not only to the sage, but also to a low hedge near the hall's back entrance. She followed them, finding a scuffed patch of earth where someone had stood, perhaps watching the kitchen. The vantage point was perfect hidden, yet with a clear view of the herb bed and the shed. She knelt, her fingers brushing the soil, and found a single blade of grass, freshly cut, as if by a careless step. It was a small thing, but Miss Marple knew that small things could unravel great crimes. Back in the village, she stopped at the Blue Boar, where the afternoon crowd was lively with speculation. Mrs. Coppins, ever the oracle, was holding forth. I'm telling you, it's that London clerk, Harrow. My nephew's friend saw him in Danamouth, bold as brass, asking about the train to St. Mary Mead. He's got guilt written all over him. Miss Marple, sipping her customary ginger beer, listened without comment. The Harrow sighting was consistent with Welch's telegram, but she remained skeptical. A city clerk poisoning a rural kitchen required opportunity and knowledge, and the garden clue pointed to a local hand. She thought of Tom Barker, whose defensiveness at the mill had struck her as more than youthful bravado. His connection to Lily was the linchpin, she felt, and the notes J might be his attempt to mislead. Leaving the inn, she made her way to the mill, hoping to find Tom or another trace of his movements. The clearing was quiet, the willows swaying in the breeze. She retraced her steps to the spot where she had found the locket and the button, her eyes scanning for new signs. Near a gnarled oak, she spotted a fresh mark in the bark's shallow cut, as if made by a pocket knife. Below it, half buried in leaves, was a cigarette case, cheap and dented, with the initials TB scratched on the lid. She picked it up, her heart quickening. Tom Barker, she thought, was careless. And carelessness was a killer's undoing. As she turned to leave, a shadow moved in the trees. She froze, her umbrella gripped tightly, but it was only a boy, one of the village lads, chasing a stray ball. She smiled at her own nerves, but the incident sharpened her resolve. The mill was a nexus of secrets, and Tom was at its center. She would confront him, but first, she needed to see Inspector Welch. At the station, Welch was sorting through a stack of reports, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're a regular fixture. Got another trinket for me?" Miss Marple produced the cigarette case and the toolshed note, laying them on his desk. "These were at the mill and the garden, Inspector. The case is Tom Barker's, I believe, and the note may be linked to Sylvia's death. I also found footprints near the foxglove, small ones, and a vantage point by the hedge. Someone was watching the kitchen." Welch's eyebrows rose, and he examined the items. "Barker, I had him in yesterday, cocky as you please, but he denied knowing Sylvia. Said he barely spoke to Lily. This case ties him to the mill, though, in the note. J could be Harrow, or Barker playing clever." Miss Marple nodded. "Or someone else, Inspector. But the garden clue is telling. The foxglove was picked deliberately, I'm sure, and Lily was persuaded to use it. Tom Barker has influence over her, and he's been evasive. I'd suggest watching him closely." Welch made a note, his skepticism softening. "I'll haul him in again. And I've got news from Yard. Harrow's been traced to a boarding house in London, but he's not there now. Could be in the wind, or he was never here. The stranger by the gate still a mystery." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. The cigarette case, the note, the footprints all pointed to Tom, but the London shadow lingered. She thought of Sylvia, her burned letters, her nighttime walks. The girl had been running from something, or someone, and it had caught her in St. Mary Mead. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts far afield. She spread out her clues, the foxglove leaf, the pressed flower, the locket, the button, the JH scrap, the mill note, the cigarette case, the toolshed note. She added the footprints, the scuffed earth, the cut bark. Each was a stitch in a complex design, and the garden clue had tightened the weave. She thought of Lily, manipulated by a stronger will, and of Tom, whose carelessness betrayed him. John Harrow, she felt, was a distraction, his shadow cast to obscure the real killer. She recalled a case from her youth, when a village boy had hidden a theft behind a flurry of lies. Tom Barker, she suspected, was playing a similar game, using Lily's trust to cover his tracks. The notes, J, was a clever touch, perhaps meant to implicate Harrow or confuse the trail. But the garden, with its silent footprints, had spoken, and Miss Marple was listening. As the fire died down, she set her knitting aside and made a plan. Tomorrow, she would confront Tom Barker, press Lily for the truth, and revisit the mill. The garden clue was a turning point, and the killer, she felt, was within reach. St. Mary Mead, with its quiet lanes and hidden passions, was a mirror of the human heart, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was its keenest observer. Chapter 8. The man in the shadows, the twilight of St. Mary Mead, was a gentle affair, with the last rays of sunlight painting the thatched roofs in hues of gold and rose. The village, nestled in its quiet valley, seemed to hold its breath as the day faded, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the first hint of frost. Yet beneath this serene facade, the ripples of Sylvia Keene's death continued to spread, stirring unease in every heart. The villagers, once content to gossip idly, now spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting to the shadows as if expecting a killer to step forth. Miss Jane Marple, with her unerring knack for seeing through such shadows, felt the weight of the mystery pressing closer, its solution tantalizingly near. In her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles silent as she reviewed the clues that had accumulated like pebbles in a stream: the foxglove leaf, Lily's pressed flower, the JH scrap, the locket, the brass button, the cigarette case, the toolshed note with its cryptic "Meet me at the mill, J." Each was a fragment of a larger truth, sharpened by the garden footprints and the scuffed earth near the hedge. The London scandal, John Harrow's elusive presence, and Tom Barker's evasiveness wove a complex web, but Miss Marple sensed the heart of the crime lay in the village, in the quiet interplay of trust and betrayal. Tonight she resolved to test her suspicions, to draw the man in the shadows into the light. Her day had begun with a visit to Inspector Welch, whose desk at the police station was a chaos of reports and telegrams. His face, lined with fatigue, brightened slightly at her arrival, a testament to her growing influence. "Miss Marple," he said, pushing aside a stack of papers, "you've got a nose for trouble. I've got news from Danny Meth. John Harrow was seen there 3 days ago, boarding a train to London. If he was our stranger by the gate, he's long gone. But I'm not convinced he's our man." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her umbrella resting across her knees. "Nor am I, Inspector. Harrow's shadow looms large, but the garden clue points closer to home. The footprints, the note, Tom Barker's cigarette case, they suggest a local hand, perhaps using Harrow's name to mislead." "Have you spoken to Tom again?" Welch nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Had him in this morning. He's a slippery one. Admits to being at the mill but swears he barely knew Sylvia. Claims the cigarette case was stolen. Says he lost it weeks ago. As for Lily, he says she's just a kid who follows him around. I don't buy it, but I've got no proof yet." Miss Marple's lips pursed thoughtfully. "Tom is careless, Inspector, and carelessness betrays. The note in the toolshed, signed J, may be his work, meant to point to Harrow. I'd suggest watching him closely, especially at the mill. It's a place of secrets, and he's at its center." Welch made a note, his skepticism softening. "I'll have a constable keep an eye on him. And I'm rechecking the kitchen staff's statements. The poison was in the stuffing, no question, but how it got there's still a puzzle. Lily's the weak link, but she's clammed up tight." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind turning to the mill. The clearing, with its whispering willows and hidden paths, was a stage for clandestine meetings, and Tom Barker, she felt, was its leading player. She decided to return there at dusk, when the village youths often gathered, hoping to catch him unawares. But first, she needed to speak with Lily, to pierce the veil of her fear. At Gossington Hall, the atmosphere was strained, the servants moving with a quiet efficiency that betrayed their unease. Mrs. Bantry, found in the library sorting condolence cards, greeted Miss Marple with a weary smile. "Jane, you're a lifeline. The house feels haunted, and Mrs. Eccles is in a foul mood. Have you made any progress? The inspector's been here again, upsetting everyone." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her handbag at her side. "Some progress, Mrs. Bantry, but the truth is elusive. I've been thinking about Lily. She's frightened, perhaps protecting someone. Might I see her? A gentle word could loosen her tongue." Mrs. Bantry nodded, leading her to the kitchen. where Mrs. Eccles was chopping carrots with a vigor that suggested she was venting her frustrations. Lily, peeling apples at the table, looked up with a start, her hands trembling. Mrs. Eccles glared at Miss Marple, her voice sharp. "Not again, Miss Marple. Lily's told you all she knows. She's no part in this wickedness." "I'm sure she's a good girl," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "But I found a note in the tool shed, Lily, and footprints by the foxglove. You were in the garden, weren't you? Did someone ask you to pick herbs?" Lily's face paled, and she dropped her knife, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean it, ma'am. I thought they were sage. Honest, he said they'd be fine, said Aunt wouldn't mind." Mrs. Eccles froze, her knife hovering. "Who? Lily, who told you that?" Lily's sobs broke free, and she buried her face in her hands. "I can't say. He'll be angry, and I'll be in trouble." Miss Marple knelt beside her, her voice gentle but firm. "You must tell us, dear. A young woman is dead, and you could help us find her killer. Was it Tom Barker?" Lily's sobs grew louder, but she shook her head, her words muffled. "Not Tom, not really. It was someone else, but I can't say I promised." Mrs. Eccles, her face ashen, pulled Lily into her arms. "That's enough, Miss Marple. She said too much already. Leave her be." Miss Marple rose, her heart quickening. Lily's slip someone other than Tom suggested a new player, or a clever ruse by Barker himself. She thanked Mrs. Eccles and left, her mind racing. The girl's fear was genuine, but her silence protected someone close, someone with power. Over her, she thought of her own niece, Clara, who had once kept a secret out of loyalty, only to regret it. Lily, she felt, was on a similar path, and time was short, as dusk fell. Miss Marple made her way to the mill, her steps cautious in the gathering dark. The clearing was bathed in a soft glow, the willows casting long shadows across the path. She moved to the oak where she had found the cigarette case, her eyes scanning for signs of recent activity. A fresh cigarette butt, unlit, lay near the tree, its paper crisp. She picked it up, noting the faint scent of tobacco, and tucked it into her handbag alongside the locket, the button, and the notes. A rustle in the bushes made her pause, her umbrella gripped tightly. She stepped back, her heart steady despite the thrill of danger. A figure emerged Lily, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. Behind her, moving with a casual stride, was Tom Barker, his grin fading as he saw Miss Marple. "Well now," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "Miss Marple, out for a stroll. This ain't your usual haunt." Miss Marple smiled, her composure unruffled. "I find the mill quite interesting, Mr. Barker. It's a place of meetings, isn't it? You and Lily seem fond of it. And Sylvia Keene, I hear, walked here too." Tom's eyes narrowed, but he shrugged. "Sylvia never spoke to her. Lily's just a friend, likes to tag along. Don't go spinning tales, miss." Lily, trembling, stayed silent, her gaze fixed on the ground. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice gentle. "Lily, you mentioned someone else, someone who told you about the herbs. Was it Tom, or another?" Lily's lips parted, but Tom cut in, his tone sharp. "She don't know nothing, and neither do I. You're fishing, old lady, and you'll catch nothing but trouble." He grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her toward the trees. "Come on, Lil. We're done here." Miss Marple watched them go, her lips tightening. Tom's aggression confirmed her suspicions. He was involved, perhaps deeply, and Lily was his shield. She thought of the notes. Jay, the cigarette case, the footprints. Tom was careless, but he was not alone. The someone else Lily had mentioned was the key, and Miss Marple felt the shadow of that figure drawing closer. Returning to the village, she stopped at the Blue Boar, where the evening crowd was lively with speculation. Mrs. Coppins, her voice carrying over the din, was regaling her listeners with a new tale. "I heard from my cousin's neighbor that London clerk's been seen again, skulking in Dannemouth. Bet he's hiding, waiting to strike again." Miss Marple, sipping her ginger beer, dismissed the tale as exaggeration. John Harrow's movements were uncertain, and the village's obsession with a city villain obscured the local truth. She thought of Tom's grin, Lily's tears, the tool-shed note. The man in the shadows was no stranger. She felt but a familiar face hiding in plain sight. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her thoughts far afield. She spread out her clues: the foxglove leaf, the pressed flower, the locket, the button, the cigarette case, the J.H. scrap, the mill note, the tool-shed note, the fresh cigarette butt. She added the encounter at the mill, Lily's slip about someone else. She thought of the garden footprints, the scuffed earth, the cut bark. Each was a stitch in a tightening pattern, and Tom Barker was its center, with Lily as his unwitting accomplice. She recalled a case from her youth when a village lad had orchestrated a theft by manipulating a younger girl. Tom, she suspected, was playing a similar game, using Lily's trust to conceal his motive. The J note was a clever misdirection, perhaps meant to implicate Harrow or confuse the trail. But Lily's fear, her mention of another figure, suggested a deeper layer. Puppet master behind the puppet dot. Miss Marple visited Mrs. Pritchard the next morning, hoping to glean more about Sylvia's final days. The widow, her eyes heavy with grief, welcomed her with a sigh. "I've been thinking, Miss Marple, about Sylvia's walks. She'd come back from the mill, looking frightened, once with mud on her shoes. I asked her about it, but she laughed it off, said she'd tripped. But I found a note in her pocket, just a scrap, with J on it. I thought it was nothing, but now—" Miss Marple's heart quickened. "A note with J. Did you keep it, Mrs. Pritchard?" The widow shook her head. "I tossed it, thinking it rubbish. Oh, I wish I'd been more careful." Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've helped more than you know. The mill is important, and so is that initial. Did Sylvia ever mention Tom Barker, or anyone else she met here?" Mrs. Pritchard frowned. "Not Tom, no, but she spoke of a man once, not by name, just said he was persistent, wouldn't leave her alone. I thought it was that Harrow fellow, but now I'm not sure." Thanking her, Miss Marple left, her mind buzzing. The mill, the J notes, Tom's presence, Lily's fear all pointed to a local conspiracy, with a London shadow as a convenient distraction. She thought of Sylvia, her secrets burned to ashes, and of Lily, caught in a web of manipulation. The man in the shadows was close, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was closing in. She returned to the police station, finding Welch reviewing a new report. "Miss Marple," he said, "you're relentless. I've got Barker under watch, and we're checking his alibi for the night of the supper. No word on Harrow, but the labs confirmed the foxglove was fresh, picked that day. It's a local job, I'm sure of it." Miss Marple produced the fresh cigarette butt, laying it on his desk. "This was at the mill, Inspector, near where I saw Tom and Lily. It's new, and it ties him to the place. I believe he's manipulating Lily, but there may be another figure, someone she's too frightened to name." Welch's eyes widened, and he took the butt, promising to follow up. "You're building a case, Miss Marple, but we need more than trinkets. If Lily won't talk, we're stuck." Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene. "She'll talk, Inspector, when she's ready. Fear is a heavy burden, but truth is heavier." She left him to his work, her mind already planning her next move. As the stars emerged over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her needles clicking softly. She thought of the mill, the shadows, the man who had orchestrated Sylvia's death. Tom Barker was the key, but the someone else Lily feared was the true puppet master. The garden clue, the mill's secrets, The village's whispers all were converging, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was ready to pull the final thread. Chapter 9. The Truth Unravels. The late afternoon in St. Mary Mead was a study in contrasts, with the golden light of autumn clashing against the village's growing unease. The church spire cast a long shadow across the green, and the air held a crisp edge, scented with fallen leaves and the faint temps of chimney smoke. Sylvia Keene's death, now a week past, had woven a thread of suspicion through the community, tightening with each whispered rumor. The villagers, once content with idle chatter, now spoke with guarded glances, as if the killer might be standing at the next market stall. Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet resolve and unerring insight, felt the mystery nearing its climax, the tangled threads of clues ready to be woven into a coherent truth in her cottage. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles stilled. As she reviewed the evidence that had accumulated like a collection of mismatched buttons, the foxglove leaf from the kitchen, Lily's pressed flower, the J.H. scrap, the locket, the brass button, the cigarette case, the tool shed note with its cryptic "meet me at the mill, J." The fresh cigarette butt from the mill, all were pieces of a puzzle, sharpened by the garden footprints, the scuffed earth near the hedge, and Lily's tearful admission of another's involvement. The London scandal, John Harrow's elusive shadow, and Tom Barker's manipulative charm had formed a complex web, but Miss Marple was certain the heart of the crime lay in St. Mary Mead, in the quiet interplay of loyalty and deceit. Today, she resolved to bring the truth to light, to gather the players and unravel the mystery once and for all. Her plan was simple, yet bold: a gathering at her cottage, where the key figures could be observed under the gentle pressure of her questions. She sent notes to Mrs. Bantry, Mrs. Pritchard, Inspector Welch, and, crucially, Lily, requesting their presence for tea at 4 o'clock. Mrs. Eccles, she decided, would be spared for now, her protective instincts too fierce to allow Lily's full candor. Miss Marple's parlor, with its chintz curtains and cozy fire, was an unlikely stage for a denouement, but she knew that truth often emerged in the most unassuming settings. As the hour approached, Miss Marple arranged her clues. On a small table, the foxglove leaf, the pressed flower, the locket, the button, the cigarette case, the J.H. scrap, the mill note, the toolshed note, and the fresh cigarette butt. Each was a silent witness to the crime, and she felt their weight as she set out her best china and a plate of scones. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow, but her mind was cool and precise, ready to cut through the shadows of deception. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, her face flushed with anticipation. "Jane, this is positively thrilling," she said, settling into an armchair. "Arthur thinks I'm mad to come, but I wouldn't miss it. Do you really think you've solved it?" Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea. "I have a theory, Mrs. Bantry, but we must test it. The truth requires patience, like a good stitch." Mrs. Pritchard followed, her mourning black stark against the parlor's soft colors. Her eyes, red-rimmed, held a flicker of hope. "Miss Marple, if you can bring justice for Sylvia, I'll be forever grateful. She deserved better than this." Inspector Welch entered next, his notebook tucked under his arm, his expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting a cup, "I hope this isn't a wild goose chase. I've got Barker under watch, and we're still chasing Harrow, but I'm here to hear you out." Lily was the last to arrive, escorted by Mrs. Bantry's maid to ensure her attendance. The girl was a shadow of herself, her face pale, her hands trembling as she perched on the edge of a chair. Her eyes darted to the door, as if she longed to flee, but Miss Marple's gentle smile held her in place. "Thank you for coming, Lily," she said. "You're very brave, and we need your help to set things right." With all assembled, Miss Marple began, her voice calm but commanding the room's attention. "Sylvia Keene's death was a tragedy, but it was no accident. She died because someone mistook foxglove for sager, so it was meant to appear. The poison was in the stuffing, as Dr. Haydock confirmed, but the question is how it got there, and why Sylvia alone was struck. Let us consider the evidence. She gestured to the table, where the clues lay like relics of a lost battle. This foxglove leaf was found in the kitchen, hidden beneath a cutting board. It was no stray, I believe, but a sign of intent. Lily, you admitted to picking herbs, thinking them sage. Is that true? Lily's hands twisted in her lap, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, ma'am, I thought they were sage. He said they'd be fine for the stuffing. Mrs. Pritchard gasped, and Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. Welch's pencil hovered over his notebook, his gaze fixed on the girl. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but relentless. And who, Lily, was he? You mentioned someone other than Tom Barker at the mill. We must know his name. Lily's tears spilled over, and she shook her head, her voice breaking. I can't. He'll hurt me, or Aunt. I promised not to tell. Mrs. Bantry reached for her hand, but Miss Marple raised a finger, her eyes never leaving Lily's. You're safe here, dear. No one can harm you. But Sylvia's death demands the truth. Was it Tom Barker who told you to pick the foxglove? Lily's sobs grew louder, and she nodded, her words tumbling out. Yes, it was Tom. He said they were sage, said Aunt wouldn't mind if I helped. I didn't know they were poison, I swear. He gave me the leaves, showed me where to pick them. I trusted him. Welch's pencil scratched furiously, and Mrs. Pritchard's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. Thank you, Lily, that was very brave. Now, let us consider Tom Barker's role. This cigarette case, found at the mill, bears his initials, and this note, signed J, was in the tool shed where Lily found the foxglove. Tom, I believe, used the initial to mislead, perhaps to point to John Harrow, the London clerk. Mrs. Bantry gasped. Tom, that scamp. But why would he want Sylvia dead? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. That is the heart of it, Mrs. Bantry. Sylvia's past holds the answer. Mrs. Pritchard, you told me Sylvia was troubled by a scandal in London, a missing brooch, and a man named John Harrow. Inspector, you confirmed Harrow's involvement. But he's been in London, not St. Mary Mead. The J.H. scrap I found was a red herring, I suspect planted by Tom to divert suspicion. Welch leaned forward, his skepticism fading. You're saying Barker framed Harrow, but what's his motive? He claims he barely knew Sylvia. Miss Marple's needles, though absent, seemed to click in her mind. Tom knew Sylvia better than he admitted. I believe they met in London, before she came to St. Mary Mead. Sylvia's burned letters, her walks to the mill, her fear of a persistent man all point to a connection. Tom, I suspect, was her lover, or hoped to be, when she came. To the village he followed, perhaps seeking to rekindle their bond. But Sylvia, ashamed of her past and wary of his intentions, rejected him. Mrs. Pritchard's voice trembled. A lover. Sylvia never spoke of a man here, but she was so guarded. Could this Tom have been so cruel? Miss Marple nodded, her voice steady. Jealousy is a powerful force, Mrs. Pritchard. Tom, spurned and humiliated, saw a chance to rid himself of Sylvia. He knew the garden, knew foxglove grew near the sage. He manipulated Lily, an innocent girl who trusted him, to pick the deadly leaves, ensuring the poison reached Sylvia's plate. Lily's sobs quieted, and she looked up, her eyes wide. He was kind to me, ma'am. Said I was special, said he needed my help. I didn't know what it would do. Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile warm. You were used, Lily, as young girls often are. Tom counted on your innocence, and on the village's readiness to blame a stranger like Harrow. The locket I found, with a woman's picture, was likely Sylvia's. dropped at the mill during a meeting with Tom, the brass button, the cigarette case, the fresh butthole tie him to the place where he planned his crime. Welch's eyes narrowed, his pencil still. That's a tidy story, Miss Marple, but it's thin on proof. Barker's a liar, no doubt, but poisoning takes planning. How'd he know Sylvia would get the fatal dose? Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. A good question, Inspector. The stuffing was a communal dish, yet only Sylvia died. I believe Tom ensured her portion was tainted. He was at the hall that day, seen near the kitchen by the gardener's boy, though he denied it. He could have slipped into the pantry while Mrs. Eccles was distracted. Adding foxglove to the stuffing meant for Sylvia's plate. The serving staff, James and Rose, were busy, and the kitchen was chaotic. It was a risk, but Tom is bold, and his hatred was stronger than his caution. Mrs. Bantry's hand flew to her throat. In my kitchen? Oh, Jane, that's monstrous. But how could he be so sure? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. He wasn't, Mrs. Bantry. That's why it's murder, not manslaughter. Tom didn't care. Who else might suffer, as long as Sylvia died? The foxglove was potent, and Sylvia, being young and healthy, succumbed quickly. The others, by chance, ate less or were less affected. It was a reckless act, but effective. Mrs. Pritchard's voice broke. Sylvia, my poor girl. She came here to escape her troubles, and they followed her. If only I'd known. Miss Marple's tone softened. You couldn't have, Mrs. Pritchard. Sylvia's secrets were her own, and Tom exploited them. Her walks to the mill, her burned letters, her fear they were signs of his pursuit. The J notes were his attempt to confuse, to cast suspicion on Harrow or another. But the garden clue, the footprints, Lily's trust, these betrayed him. Welch closed his notebook, his expression grim. If you're right, Miss Marple, Barker's in deep. I'll bring him in tonight, see if he cracks. Lily's testimony will help, if she repeat it in court. Lily, wiping her eyes, nodded. I'll tell them, sir. I want to make it right. For Miss Keene, Miss Marple smiled, her heart lightening. You're a brave girl, Lily. The truth is hard, but it frees us all. As the gathering dispersed, Mrs. Bantry lingered, her eyes bright with admiration. Jane, you're a marvel. I thought it was that Harrow fellow, or some city plot. But Tom Barker, right under our noses. How did you know? Miss Marple's needles, now in her hands, resumed their rhythm. People are the same everywhere, Mrs. Bantry village, or city. Tom's jealousy, Lily's trust, Sylvia's secrets there, as old as time. I only watched, and listened, and saw the pattern. Like knitting, it's all in the stitches. Mrs. Pritchard, clutching her handkerchief, thanked Miss Marple with a trembling smile. You've given me peace, Miss Marple. Sylvia can rest now. Welch, pausing at the door, tipped his hat. I'll say this, Miss Marple, you've got a mind like a steel trap. I'll let you know when we've got Barker. As the door closed, Miss Marple sat alone, her fire casting shadows on the walls. She thought of Sylvia, a girl caught in a web of her own making, and of Lily, a pawn in a cruel game. Tom Barker, with his sly charm and reckless hate, had spun the web, but Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, had torn it apart. She spread out her clues one last time, their purpose fulfilled. The foxglove leaf, the pressed flower, the locket, the button, the cigarette case, the JH scrap, the mill note, the tool shed note, the cigarette butt. Each had played its part, and the truth, once hidden, now stood clear. She recalled a case from her youth, when a village girl had been betrayed by a lover's false promises. Sylvia's story was not so different, and Tom's was a tale as old as betrayal itself. The London shadow, John Harrow, had been a distraction, his name used to muddy the waters. The mill, the garden, the kitchen, these were the true stages of the crime. And Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, had walked them all, as the clock struck 6. She set her knitting aside and poured another cup of tea. The village would talk, of course, spinning new tales of Tom's villainy and Lily's innocence. But for now, St. Mary Mead was quiet, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. The truth had unraveled. And justice, like a well-knit shawl, would wrap the village in its embrace. Chapter 10. The reckoning. The autumn dusk settled over St. Mary Mead with a quiet solemnity. The village lanes bathed in a soft violet glow as the last light bled from the sky. The church bells tolled faintly, their mournful notes mingling with the rustle of leaves skittering across the cobbles. Sylvia Keene's death, now laid bare by Miss Jane Marple's keen insight, had shifted the village's rhythm, replacing suspicion with a somber clarity. The truth, so long obscured by whispers and shadows, stood revealed, and the community, though relieved, bore the weight of its own complicity in overlooking the darkness within its bounds. Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence and unrelenting mind, had brought justice to the fore. But the reckoning was not yet complete. In her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting needles moving with a gentle cadence that belied the intensity of her thoughts. The parlor, with its chintz, curtains, and polished oak, was a haven of order, yet her mind lingered on the chaos of human motives, jealousy, betrayal, and the fragile trust that had led to Sylvia's end. The clues that had guided her: the foxglove leaf, Lily's pressed flower, the J.H. scrap, the locket, the brass button, the cigarette case, the toolshed note. The fresh cigarette butt lay tucked away in her handbag, their purpose fulfilled. Tom Barker's confession, extracted by Inspector Welch after Lily's tearful testimony, had sealed the case, but Miss Marple knew that justice, like a well-knit shawl, required careful finishing to hold its shape. The day had begun with a flurry of activity at the police station, where Welch, fortified by Miss Marple's revelations, had confronted Tom Barker with a relentless barrage of questions. Miss Marple, invited to observe at Welch's grudging insistence, had stood quietly in the corner, her faded blue eyes missing nothing. Tom, his cocky grin replaced by a sullen scowl, had initially denied everything, claiming Lily's accusations were the fantasies of a lovesick girl. But Welch, armed with the cigarette case, the toolshed note, and Lily's account, pressed harder, detailing the garden footprints and the gardener's boy's sighting of Tom near the kitchen on the day of the supper. "You were there," Barker Welch had said, his voice like iron. "You gave Lily the foxglove, told her it was sage. You knew it would kill, and you made sure Sylvia got the fatal dose. Why her? What did she do to you?" Tom's defiance crumbled under the weight of the evidence, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette, the match flaring in the dim room. "It wasn't meant to be like that," he muttered, his voice low. "Sylvia, she was mine, back in London. We met when she was with the Harrisons. She was sweet on me, said we'd run off together. But then that brooch went missing, and she turned cold, said I was trouble. When she came here, I thought we could start again, but she laughed in my face, called me a nobody." Miss Marple, silent, had noted the bitterness in his tone, the wounded pride that had festered into hatred. She thought of her own nephew, Raymond, who had once been stung by a lover's rejection but had chosen art over revenge. Tom, with no such outlet, had let his anger curdle into murder. "So, you killed her," Welch pressed, leaning forward. "You used Lily, played on her trust, to poison the stuffing." Tom's eyes darted to Miss Marple, as if seeking an escape, but her steady gaze held him fast. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted her to suffer, like she made me suffer. I knew about foxglove. My gran used it for her heart, warned me it was deadly in big doses. I saw it in the garden, saw my chance. Lily was easy to sway, always mooning over me. I told her the leaves were sage, said it'd impress her aunt. I slipped into the kitchen when Mrs. Eccles was out, mixed the foxglove into the stuffing bowl. I figured Sylvia'd get sick, maybe die, and no one trace it to me. Welch's pencil scratched furiously, capturing every word, and the J note, the JH scrap. You planted those 2.2 John Harrow, didn't you? Tom nodded, his shoulders slumping. Heard Sylvia talk about Harrow, knew he was trouble in London. Thought if anyone looked, they'd blame him. I didn't expect it to work so well. Miss Marple's lips tightened, but she said nothing, her mind cataloguing Tom's confession. His recklessness, his manipulation of Lily, his callous disregard for others who might have eaten the stuffing all, painted a portrait of a young man consumed by spite. She thought of Sylvia, her laughter at the supper, her burned letters, her futile flight from a past that had caught her in the end. Welch, satisfied, had Tom taken to a cell, promising Miss Marple a full report. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, a rare note of respect in his voice. "Barker's confession ties it up, and Lily's testimony will seal it in court. I'll make sure she's treated leniently. She's a victim too." Miss Marple had nodded, her smile faint. "Thank you, Inspector. Lily deserves a chance to heal, and Sylvia deserves justice. But the village will need time to mend as well." Leaving the station, she had walked to Gossington Hall, where Mrs. Bantry was grappling with the aftermath of the revelation. The hall, its gardens now tinged with the first frost, seemed to sag under the weight of its role in the tragedy. Mrs. Bantry, found in the morning room with a cup of cold tea, greeted Miss Marple with a mix of awe and horror. "Jane, it's unbelievable," she said, setting her cup down with a clatter. "Tom Barker, that insolent boy, a murderer, and poor Lily, caught in his scheme. Arthur's beside himself, says we'll never live this down. How did you see it, when we were all so blind?" Miss Marple settled into a chair, her handbag at her side. "People are predictable, Mrs. Bantry, if you watch them closely. Tom's pride, Lily's trust. Sylvia's secrets, they followed a pattern I've seen before, in other villages, other lives. The garden clue, the mill's shadows, Lily's fear, they all pointed to Tom, though he hid behind a stranger's name." Mrs. Bantry shook her head, her eyes wide. "I thought it was that Harrow fellow, or some London vendetta. But Tom, right here. I'll never host another supper, Jane. The thought of poison in my kitchen." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "You'll host again, Mrs. Bantry, when the wounds have healed. The hall is your home, not a crime scene, and Sylvia's memory deserves happier days." Mrs. Bantry managed a weak smile. "You're right, of course, but what about Lily and Mrs. Eccles? They're both in pieces." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Lily will recover, with time and care. As for Mrs. Eccles, her heart is broken, but she's strong. They'll find their way." Leaving the hall, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Pritchard, whose cottage was a shrine to Sylvia's memory, with photographs and keepsakes arranged on every surface. The widow, her face etched with grief, welcomed Miss Marple with a quiet dignity. "You've done a great thing, Miss Marple," she said, offering tea. "Sylvia can rest now, knowing her killer's caught. But I keep thinking if I'd watched her closer, if I'd asked about those letters." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression gentle. "You loved her, Mrs. Pritchard, and that was enough. Sylvia's choices were her own, and Tom's. Malice was beyond your control. Take comfort in the truth. Freeze her, and you." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes brimmed with tears, but she nodded, clutching a locket that held Sylvia's picture. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Your kindness means more than you know." As Miss Marple walked home, the village was settling into evening, the lights in the cottages warm against the gathering dark. She thought of Lily, who had been sent to a distant relative in Devon, spared prosecution for her unwitting role. Mrs. Eccles, heartbroken by her niece's involvement and her own failure to see Tom's influence, had resigned, leaving Gossington Hall for a quieter life in a neighboring village. Colonel Bantry, grumbling about village lunatics, had retreated to his study, while Mrs. Bantry planned a quiet winter, vowing to avoid grand gatherings until the scandal faded. At her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting resumed as she gazed at the moonlit garden. The village, she knew, would heal, its rhythms restored by time and routine. But Sylvia's death had left a mark, a reminder of the fragility beneath St. Mary Mead's idyllic surface. She thought of her own youth, when a neighbor's betrayal had taught her the power of quiet observation. That lesson had served her well, guiding her through the maze of clues to Tom's guilt. She opened her handbag, glancing at the clues one last time before tucking them away. The foxglove leaf, the pressed flower, the locket, the button, the cigarette case, the J.H. scrap, the mill note, the toolshed note, the cigarette butt. Each had played its part, a silent chorus to Sylvia's tragedy. Tom's confession had clarified their meaning, revealing a crime born of spurned love and reckless hate. John Harrow, the London clerk, had been a phantom, his name used to obscure Tom's tracks. The mill, the garden, the kitchen, these were the true stages. And Miss Marple had walked them with a clarity born of experience. She thought of Lily, a girl manipulated by a boy's false charm, and of Sylvia, whose secrets had drawn a predator to her door. The village, with its gossip and its silences, had been complicit in its way, failing to see Tom's darkness until it was too late. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, each stitch a meditation on human nature, its passions, its flaws, its capacity for redemption. A knock at the door startled her, and she rose to find Inspector Welch, his hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "I thought you'd want to know. Barker's been charged, and he's not fighting it. Lily's statement was enough, and your evidence clinched it. He'll face trial next month, but it's a done deal. You've got my thanks, and the village's, though they'll never say it." Miss Marple smiled, offering him a chair. "Justice is its own reward, Inspector. But I'm glad for Sylvia, and for Lily. Will you have tea?" Welch declined, his smile wry. "No time, I'm afraid. But I'll say this, you're a force, Miss Marple. St. Mary Mead's lucky to have you." As he left, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the fire casting shadows on the walls. The reckoning was complete, but the village would carry its scars, a reminder of the cost of silence. She thought of Sylvia's laughter, Lily's tears, Tom's confession. Each was a note in a somber melody, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, had brought it to its close. The clock struck 9, and she set her knitting aside, her eyes drifting to the window. The moon hung low, silvering the garden where secrets had bloomed and died. St. Mary Mead, with its tidy lanes and hidden depths, was hers to guard, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and razor-sharp mind, was its silent sentinel. The truth had been her weapon, and the reckoning, though painful, had set the village free.